Nails like this make for terrible hammers. So today we're going to take this high carbon steel railroad spike and turn it into this little ball peen hammer. So if you've watched my videos in the past, you may know that I really enjoy turning high carbon steel railroad spikes into various other tools. I've made a scissor, a C-clamp, a dividing caliper, even a hand vise, and a couple other things. So I'm going to be using my induction forge to heat up this railroad spike in an attempt to turn this into a ball peen hammer. I thought the concept of making a hammer from a nail would be pretty fun, and it's an interesting challenge when you have a finite piece of material like a railroad spike and you have to reshape it into something completely new. Now obviously the railroad spike as it comes is a little long and narrow, and I'm going to need to upset it, which is going to be sort of kind of reallocating that mass and shrinking it down so that it is a little bit shorter and wider and a little bit more looking like a hammer blank or a blank piece of material. Now the way that I'm doing this using the induction forge is basically going to allow me to heat sections of this material very specifically so that I can push the material down and then thus forcing it outward and allowing it to sort of fatten up and shrink as I go. Now this is a pretty laborious and time-consuming process because as you're pressing that material down with hammer strikes, you want to make sure that you're kind of keeping it straight and sort of adjusting it as it goes. Using the induction forge, it allows me to really sort of dedicate where that heat's going to go and dictate it really closely. And I just have to be a little bit careful as I do so that I can make sure that I don't weld in too much forge scale, and I can kind of move things around, grab them with the tongs in different ways, and you can see how it's starting to kind of fatten up on that end. Now at a certain point, I'm going to switch over to a little bit heavier of a hammer to kind of do this process a little bit quicker, because while I want to make sure I do this in a controlled manner, the heavier my hammer strikes are and the harder I'm able to hit it, the more material is going to move during every heat. Now doing this with the induction forge might not be the fastest way. You could probably do this a little quicker in a conventional forge, but I like to use the induction forge to kind of make sure I don't overheat my material and keep things nice and isolated. You can see now relatively quickly I've been able to shrink down that material and turn it into what's more of kind of a shorter rectangle than that long railroad spike shape that I started with. Now this moved quickly in the video, but it actually took a fair bit of work. Now to make a punch mark where I'm going to try to drift the eye of this hammer. And now you can see where the induction forge really shines. I just want to heat the center of this little billet, and now I can use this handled hammer eye punch that my friend Paul Pinto made me a few years ago to start drifting out what would be the hammer eye. So I start drifting from one side, and then I actually use my dividing caliper that I made in another video to make sure that I mark it correctly on the opposite side of the hammer. So what I'm doing is I'm striking one time with the handled hammer eye punch and then spinning the billet around 180 degrees and then striking it again. I'm using beeswax as a punching lubricant to make sure that this punch doesn't stick inside as I'm trying to do this process. Now I'm trying to make sure this piece is nice and hot when I do this because I am trying to drift a fairly large hole in a relatively small piece of material, and I want to make sure that it doesn't tear or crack in any way and stays intact. Now I like to do this process nice and slowly, and then eventually once that slug is getting close to the end, I put it on this little Hardy tool and I'm able to sort of press it and hit it again till it just starts to break out the bottom, and then I can sort of wiggle it out with a pair of tongs after a couple of more strikes. There you can see the slug coming out of the bottom of the billet. Now with that hole drifted, I can actually take a hammer eye drift and I can kind of reshape the hole to make it the proper shape to hold a wooden handle. Now this is a cast hammer eye drift that I bought actually at a garage sale, and it's perfect size for this. I'm using the Pritchell hole in my large anvil to kind of support the material as I hammer it through. And once I hammer it through, I hammer on what you could consider the cheeks of the hammerhead so that I can kind of reshape things. Once that's drifted, I start to round out one side so I get closer to the shape that I'm looking for in its final form. Now I'm using my guillotine tool to isolate the hammer face on this little billet. Now the guillotine tool is a really useful tool for stuff like this. I made this tool a few years ago based on the design from my friend Dufton, and I made these dies so that I could isolate with that sort of 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch round on both sides. This is a really, really efficient and really precise way to isolate material in such a way. You can see how quickly it makes that perfectly isolated kind of hammer face, and you can even sort of use it as a clamp to do other work. I just love the way that that kind of round isolation looks. And once I'm done with that, I can then kind of heat the center of the billet again, and I can drive my drift back through it to kind of adjust that hole. Now you can see the cheeks on the side of this are pretty thin, so I want to be careful not to do any damage. That's why I'm heating it and sort of reshaping it using light blows with a smaller hammer, just to make sure that I can get things kind of to stay in the right spot. Now I'm going to be kind of making the ball peen side of this using this cool swage block that I got from my friend Chris Cash at Mount Phillip Metalworks, which has these little kind of cup ends in it, which will help me get a kind of semi-rounded piece on one end before I take it over to the grinder. Now it's essentially rough forged, so I took it over to the wire wheel and cleaned it up, and then I take it over to my Ameribraid 2x72 grinder with this is an 80 grit faired grinding belt. If you've watched my videos in the past, you know I really like the faired abrasives, and they've been supporting the shop for a while. They've got some 2x72 grinding belts that are now out, and they are some of the best I've ever used. They work incredibly well, and they're super high quality abrasives, so you should definitely check those out if you're a knife maker or you use a belt grinder for any amount of work. I'm regrinding the ball peen and regrinding the face just to make things nice and flat, and I move up from the 80 grit to a 220 just to kind of smooth things out and make them look nice. This is pretty quick and easy work, and I'm really just trying to refine this and get past some of my rough forging to make the thing look a little nicer. Now once again, I go over and kind of refine the eye in this hammer, and I want to make sure that I have it kind of exactly what I want. Now while I was doing this, I realized that I felt the ball peen section of this hammer was just kind of out of proportion with the rest of it, so I wanted to isolate the material down a little bit further and then go ahead and shrink the ball a little bit dimensionally so it would be slightly smaller than the regular striking side of the hammerhead. This is pretty easy to do in a blacksmithing scenario because you can literally re-isolate and reallocate that material as long as there's material there to move. While I wait for that to cool down, I decided to cut out the handle. This is out of a piece of ash, a little scrap that I had laying around. And as sort of a rough template, I had another handle that had broken off another hammer that I traced out roughly to get myself a basis of shape. Now once I had kind of a rough shape cut, I went back over to the belt grinder, and now I'm using an 80 grit silicon carbide grinding belt here with my dust collector set up to just sort of shape and grind this handle. Now there's a million different ways to make a wooden handle for a hammer or an axe. A lot of people use a spoke shave or a Shiwa rasp, but in this case I found that it's nice and easy to just use the belt grinder and get it close, and then from there you can hand sand and clean things up a little bit more. Now I'm also grinding in where the actual hammer head is going to go on, sort of the top of the handle, and I actually got a pretty good fit in a relatively short amount of time, which for me is pretty rare. I usually have a hard time kind of fitting the hammer handle for the hammer head, but this actually worked out pretty well, and you can see I've got like kind of a unique sort of Coke bottle shape to the handle, which I like and I think will be nice and comfortable. Now since I reshaped the ball peen side of this, I had to actually regrind it again, and in this case I wanted to take off a little more material than I did the first time, so I switched down to a 60 grit belt, and this makes quick work of sort of shrinking down that ball peen so it would be a little more proportional with the striking head on this hammer. By using that sort of soft section right in between the flat platen and that contact wheel, I can kind of have a little bit of give that I can then round out, and then I can go up to the 80 grit that I was using, then up to the 220, and I can more or less start to polish the faces and polish the ball peen on this. You can see the way it's going to kind of fit. I'm sort of test fitting as I go, making sure that it looks nice, and then I can keep going. So now I want to harden and then temper this hammerhead, and this is a cool thing you can do with the induction forge. Now I'm starting with some vegetable oil, and I heated it up using a piece of scrap material, but before I hardened the hammerhead, I wanted to put my touch mark, which is just a little Z in one of the side of the cheeks. So now I'm heating the ball peen and the striking side of this hammer just a little bit on each side, kind of adjusting my heat between the two to get them nice and red hot, and then I'm going to quench them in the oil and let them sit for a little while. This is going to give me a very hard face with this high carbon hammerhead. And then I like to go ahead and wire wheel off the sort of scale that pops on there so that I can see my temper colors when I temper this back. Now I know there'll be someone in the comments who is going to say that the high carbon railroad spike doesn't have enough carbon in it to make a really hard kind of knife or hammer, but I think for a size hammer that this is, it's going to work just fine. Now I'm just using a little map gas torch to temper back the faces. You can see the way that color is appearing, and then I put a little fan next to it to keep that heat from creeping too far in. Now while that's cooling down, I can go into the wood shop and just sort of work on this handle. I'm sanding it down with my regular orbital sander just to kind of smooth out any of the rough marks from the grinder, and also kind of smooth out the bottom of the handle so that it's nice and will accept the finish and look really well when it's all done. Once the hammerhead is cooled down, I go ahead and sort of do my kind of final finish and polishing. I go to 220 up to a 400, then a 600, and then again I'll go over to the buffer and I'll actually buff both sides of this. Now when you're making a hammer, any imperfections on the faces will transfer to the work, so I like a mirror polished hammer, and it was pretty quick to do using those couple steps and these ferrite belts. Now I found a piece of mahogany that I'm going to be using as the wedge in the handle, and unfortunately my camera shut off midway through cutting that slit in the handle, but I think you get the point. I cut in a slit and drove the wedge using some glue, and I let that glue sit overnight. The next day I cut off the top, and I could basically get to finishing this up. I did another little quick hand sanding and a little bit of sanding with the orbital, and then I'm going to be using the Total Boat Wood Honey as the finish. This is an all-natural finish you can use on cutting boards, and it just has a nice smell to it. It's a nice all-natural finish that'll help protect this ash handle, and I can actually get some on the head, and it'll help protect the head from rusting too. Here you can see the final form versus where it started. A hammer from a nail. I think this is going to be a really useful little hammer, and I really love this type of project, you know, kind of making something new out of something ordinary, and I'm really happy with how it came out. It's not the nicest shape, it's a little ugly, but it's mine, and then I'm happy with it. Thanks for watching.